that perished, many of them reportedly did so after delivering their wives and children to lifeboats. As one of the 168 male second-class passengers aboard the Titanic, you probably belong to the middle class. Second-class passengers included filmmaker William Harvey, who was hired by the White Star Line to film the voyage, and the ship's musicians, who famously played inspiring music until they were swallowed by the icy waters. Your chances of surviving. Men in second class aboard the Titanic had the lowest percent survival rate, at a meager 8%. Only 14 men in second class made it through the ordeal. All 8 of the musicians on board died, and only the bodies of band leader Wallace Hartley, bass violinist John Clark, and violinist John Hume were recovered. Several of the casualties from the men in second class were clergymen who stayed with other passengers until the very end. Reverends Robert Bateman and John Harper, as well as fathers Thomas Biles, Ernest Courtney, Charles Kirkland, William Latnin, Wozas Montvilla, and Joseph Pereshitz, all held second-class tickets, and despite being of different faiths, made their final stand together as the Titanic sank, bringing comfort to the dying at the cost of their own lives. Continuing the prayers, he led us to where the boats were being lowered, said the Evening World of Father Thomas Biles. Helping the women and children in, he whispered to them words of comfort and encouragement. Third-class passenger Farid Hussein Qasim on the Titanic was with his relative Nasif Qasim Abid al-Munaj, who had already become a successful merchant in the United States. Juho Strandin was a farmer from Finland. Penguin was a Swedish native who had traveled home to visit family from the United States. And Camillus Wittenkrongel was on his way from Belgium to Detroit, Michigan, in hopes of a better life. As third-class passengers, these men made friends, spent time below deck with each other, and, according to Kenklin, who survived, enjoyed accommodations better than they could have imagined on the ship. It was said that many passengers in third class were so unaccustomed to indoor plumbing that they were given automatic toilets to use, something even first-class passengers didn't have. This was because the staff feared they might not be accustomed to the plumbing. Your chances of surviving. This is a bit of a numbers trick. Only 24% of the third-class passengers on the Titanic survived, and just over 16% of the men were part of that group. There were 462 men in steerage, and of those, only 75 made it out. The staggering loss of life among third-class passengers has been attributed to their position on the ship, specifically behind locked gates, but accounts tend to differ as to whether or not steerage passengers could get to the lifeboats. One steerage passenger, Daniel Buckley, survived and later testified that though steerage passengers were initially prohibited from entering the first-class decks, they had the same opportunities to get into lifeboats. Ruth Bowker and Mabel Martin worked in one of the restaurants on the Titanic. Both women were single and worked in hostels prior to their careers at sea. Other female crew members, stewardesses like Mabel Bennett and bath attendant Maud Slocum, were women from large families. Bennett was one of 10 children and was married with a child, but living with her sister prior to working on the Titanic. Your chances of surviving. Of the 23 female crew members on board the Titanic, 20 survived. The 87% survival rate was again a result of women and children first rule. One survivor, Violet Jessup, was a stewardess aboard the ship and helped passengers and crew into lifeboats before boarding one herself. Once she was aboard lifeboat number 16, she cared for an infant until she could find the child's mother. After surviving the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, Jessup kept working at sea and was aboard the Britannic in 1916 when it sank in the Aegean Sea after hitting a mine. Male crew members aboard the Titanic worked as doctors, carpenters, stewards, engineers, electricians, and window cleaners. The Titanic's ship officer, Captain Edward J. Smith, had a long career at sea and was in bed at the time of the iceberg strike. Men like fireman George Beauchamp were working below deck and were on duty when the ship began to sink. Because it was late at night, Harold Bride was in bed, but his fellow